thank you for joining me tonight with Joe DiGiacomo. We are here to talk about the rhododendron legacy at Laurelwood Arboretum. My name is Patty Slazak. I'm one of the reference librarians at the Wayne Public Library, and we recently were able to create a collaboration between the library and Laurelwood Arboretum to cover a variety of topics that are interesting to our patrons as well as to those who are fans of the Laurelwood Arboretum. So I just want to introduce to you Joseph DiGiacomo, vernacularly known as Joe, and give you a little introduction to who he is. Joe is a resident of Little Falls. He retired in 2009 after a 35-year career in municipal government as Tenafly Borough Administrator, Cedar Grove Township Manager, and Assistant Business Administrator and Budget Officer for the City of Trenton. He received his BA degree from William Patterson University right here in Wayne, and his MPA degree from Penn State University. Joe is an avid gardener and earned his Master Gardener certification in 2011 from the Rutgers Master Gardener program. So welcome, Joe. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Patty.
I'd like to just first start and get to know a little bit about what brought you to gardening and to volunteering at Laurelwood Arboretum. Was this a hobby or passion that you had from childhood, or is it something that propagated, and that was pun intended, over the course of the many years?
Well, when I was still working in Tenafly, I learned about the Master Gardener program from a Master Gardener that we actually hired to work in our Tenafly's award-winning rose garden in the Davis Johnson Park in Tenafly. And several times a month during my lunch hour, I would visit the park and talk to her about the program. I've always been a gardener, learned from my parents and my grandparents. I currently have a large pollinator garden in my rear yard, and I focus on pollinator plants that will attract various kinds of butterflies as well as host plants. When I retired, one of the items on my bucket list was to enroll in the Rutgers Master Gardener program. So, and I enrolled in the class of 2010, 2011, and I completed my certification in 2011. Looking back on it, it was probably one of the best things I've ever done. Not only was it an interesting program and I learned a lot about plants, but the volunteer opportunities exposed me to a lot of other master gardeners and general gardeners who are very interesting people, and many of them have become my friends. The way the Rutgers program works is after your certification, if you want to continue your certification each year, you have to complete a number of designated number of volunteer hours at approved sites. And Laurelwood is an approved site under the Master Gardener program. Living in Little Falls, probably not unlike I've learned a lot of people in Wayne. I'd never been to Laurelwood, but I decided to go to Laurelwood, sign up for the volunteer program. And my interests were not only horticultural projects, but because of my background, I volunteered for writing grants for Laurelwood as kind of a sideline. So that's how I got interested. After I got to Laurelwood, my interest was more in the history of the site and the Knippenbergs initially than it was the rhododendrons. And I spent a lot of time researching the background of how Laurelwood Gardens at the time, now Laurelwood Arboretum, came about. And probably more importantly, I was interested in the role that the Nippenbergs had in hybridizing rhododendrons. And I contacted the American Rhododendron Society as well as the Royal Horticultural Society to obtain any information I could get from them about hybridization at Laurelwood Gardens. And when we go through the program, there are some slides I will discuss about what I found out from them. Also, I was lucky to find out that all of the journals from the American Rhododendron Society dating back to 1947 are available on Virginia Tech's digital library for public view. And I spent a lot of time searching their site for any information about Laurelwood Gardens or John and Dorothy Nippenberg. So that was the start. I also found, while after probably my second visit to Laurelwood, that over the years there had been efforts to identify and categorize the rhododendrons at Laurelwood. As a matter of fact, one of the leading volunteers in that area is signed up for the program tonight, Harold Ashcroft. He left behind very detailed records on inventories and locations of rhododendrons. And so did Dorothy Nippenberg, a very detailed inventory of the types of not only rhododendrons, but trees and shrubs. And what I learned happened is over the years, the project was started and then stopped. And some of the volunteers moved on to other places. And I asked if we could restart that program. And that's what we're going to learn about tonight. We've brought it, I think, quite far along. Everything is now computerized. We've identified nearly 400 rhododendrons and categorized them. They're all in a database now. They all have tags and accession numbers. I've estimated that there's over 500 rhododendrons on the site, and we still have some work to do, but it's been very, very interesting.
I find this really fascinating because as a librarian, we use a Dewey Decimal System to categorize and have archival information as well, and to make sure that it's able to be, the information is able to be utilized and accessed by the public and found. So I love the fact of hearing that this a category system is in effect for the rhododendrons and the various plants that are available there. So well done from this librarian. Now, did you want to talk, Joe, about the early history of Laurelwood and the Nippenberg legacy?
Yes, I thought this might be a time to share the PowerPoint. This is actually a 1950 photograph of the site. And those of you that are familiar with the site, you'll see closest to the screen, I believe that's Vale Road. I'm sorry, coming down the hill, we have Pines Lake West. The Nippenbergs actually lived across the street from what is now Laurelwood Arboretum. And they purchased the property in the late 1940s and actually started hybridizing in around 1955. And for many, many years, it was a commercial nursery that specialized in rhododendrons and azaleas. Some of the information I discovered during my research and comments from Dorothy is that one of the reasons they were interested in this particular site was because of the large number of eastern hemlocks on the site, which they felt would provide shade for the rhododendrons. And to this day, we have a great stand of eastern hemlocks that are still on the site.
Joe, for those of us who are not as familiar with rhododendrons and gardening, like myself, are rhododendrons more apt to thrive in than shade than direct sun, or can they thrive in either climate?
There are some that can survive in direct sun. Usually morning sun is best and afternoon shade, but it depends on either the species or the hybrid. But there are some that can tolerate heat, but I would think generally they like to be shaded. If we move on to the next slide, this is Dorothy Nippenberg for you that aren't familiar with her. And Dorothy and John were very active in the New York rhododendron chapter. And actually in 1964, Dorothy did a slideshow tour of Laurelwood Gardens for the members of the New York rhododendron chapter. And I found this particular quote of hers very interesting, that it was always their plan to turn the property over to the town of Wayne for it to become a public park. And in this particular statement, she called it a rhododendron park. And the last comment was their acknowledgement that because of that plan, they spent the rest of their lives really bringing in various varieties of rhododendrons from around the country and actually from other countries to display in Laurelwood. So to me, there are two important components of their legacy. One is the legacy that they left for the residents of Wayne and New Jersey generally. And the other was their involvement in hybridizing rhododendrons, which they then shared with other people throughout the country. And outside of Wayne, Dorothy in particular was very well known as a hybridizer. As a matter of fact, my research revealed that she was one of the few women that were directly involved in hybridizing that had not taken over hybridizing from their husband. Dorothy was a leader and well known. And so that was kind of the beginning. Our records, as I indicated, she left pretty detailed records. And there were times when some of the early start of a rhododendron, they also had a nursery down on the eastern shore of Virginia, where they would start some of the plants in the more mild weather. And when they got large enough, they would ship them up to Laurelwood Gardens. And there's correspondence in the file from Dorothy that in September in particular, they might have 5 to 7 trucks pull into Laurelwood Gardens in a week that they would load up with rhododendrons and ship to other places. So I found that very interesting. It was kind of like a very secret. I'm not so sure people that live around Laurelwood Gardens today would like to see 5 or 7 trucks pulling in and out of there, but this was mainly in the 60s.
Was
The
that when it
other,
was still a nursery, Joe, or
I'm
was that
sorry, excuse me?
was that when it was still a nursery?
Yes, definitely. Uh, a lot of the early hybridization started, John started preparing the site in the 50s. Dorothy started not hybridizing in the 50s, so it went on into the 60s. In the 70s, and even into the 80s, Dorothy won a number of awards at flower shows, not only in New Jersey, but nationally for some of her rhododendrons. And we have a booklet in the Nippenberg Center of a lot of her awards that the public can look at. The reason I included this slide is because I wanted to show that what was going on at Laurelwood Gardens was being followed from people in other parts of the country. And this is a letter from Guy Nearing, who was a very prolific New Jersey hybridizer. He had several nurseries in New Jersey. We have several of his rhododendrons. And Joseph Gable, who was also one of the early hybridizers, he was in Pennsylvania. And they had about a 20-year letter writing exchange, which I found very interesting, being a history nut. For those of you that ever have read the one of the biographies on John Adams, where he wrote 3,000 or so letters to his wife, this made me think of that. And I've read a lot of their letters because they are available in the archives. But what's interesting about this is that in 1956, they knew what was happening at Laurelwood Gardens. And they made a comment about John. I found it kind of amusing that they mentioned that he had made some mistakes, just like all of us have if you've tried propagating or hybridizing. And they mentioned that he'll carry them through as Dexter did. Well, Charles O. Dexter was probably one of our America's pioneer hybridizers. He hybridized from his estate in Sandwich, Massachusetts, which is now a big museum. Although he died before, I think he died in 1943, before Laurelwood Gardens became Laurelwood Arboretum. We have many of his hybrids here, and there's evidence that many of his seedlings ended up here because of Dorothy's involvement with other hybridizers, and they used to exchange things. He used to send out throughout the country over 5,000 of his seedlings a year. Although he was a great hybridizer, he was a terrible record keeper. And he actually, instead of naming them, most of his hybrids did not become named until long after he died. As a matter of fact, Dorothy named some of them, and she gets credit for them, and you'll see later in another slide. So I think, to me, this is all part of the legacy, that they developed this nursery in Wayne, New Jersey, that people in other parts of the country knew about.
Excuse me, Joe, I just had a question for you.
Mhm.
Is the hybridization that was done by Dorothy and John, and is it something that she started and then he also joined her in doing, or is it something
She
he
was
also
the
did?
main hybridizer. Although, if we can go to the next slide, this is I had reached out to not only the American Rhododendron Society, but the Royal Horticultural Society. The Royal Horticultural Society is the international registration authority for the genus Rhododendrons. And in North America, the American Rhododendron Society is the place where if you were a hybridizer and wanted to register your hybrid, you would submit an application to them, which we've done actually for an azalea, which I'll talk about later. And then the Royal Horticultural Society would either approve it or not. So I reached out to them and I just asked them generally, do you have a record of any rhododendrons that are connected to either Laurelwood Gardens or Dorothy Nippenberg or John Nippenberg? And they gave me this list of over 50 that they have credit for hybridizing. Now, the ones that, and I'm going to go down to Blush Button, which is about the fifth one down. We have records that indicate that it was one of Dorothy's favorites, and we still have it in the Arboretum. It's on Long Valley Road. We have been trying without success to propagate from it. But if you see here, she took one of Charles Dexter's, she actually took two of COD is Charles O. Dexter, Dexter's plants, took pollen from them to create a new plant. She raised it. The N means she named it. She introduced it commercially at Laurelwood Gardens, and REG means she, in 1966, she gets credit for registering it. Now, the registration is not necessarily the plant. The registration is the name. And the reason for that over the years is before the registration process became so detailed. If you look at the approximately 20,000 named hybrids in the world, many of them have the same name, because before there was this registration process, people from other parts of the country or other parts of the world came up with the same name for some reason.
Excuse me, Joe, I just want to ask a question about colors and rhododendrons. I never realized how many varieties of colors and that there are in rhododendrons. Is there a number or a ballpark number as to how many different
Oh
colors?
boy, I was hoping you weren't going to ask that question.
Sorry.
In the identification process of maybe the 7 features we look for, which I can go over, obviously color is one of them. And when we at Laurelwood wanted to register an azalea, which we named Laurelwood Sunset, we had to go through a very detailed process. And one of the things you have to do is describe the color. And to my surprise, like just about everything with the Royal Horticultural Society, they have a color chart with 970 variations of color. It's like looking at a Benjamin Moore color chart when you're painting your living room. And you have to try to line up the color with something on their color chart, and they have numbers to go with them. The problem is, I've learned, the color will look different if it's morning and afternoon, a sunny day or an overcast day. If the rhododendron's in its bud and it just bloomed compared to 2 weeks later. It's a difficult process. And one of the people that helped us with our identification project was Dr. Al Fitzberg, who was a past president of the Friends of Laurelwood Arboretum. He was also a past president of the Tappan Zee chapter of the American Rhododendron Society. And he has his own rhododendron garden where he lives in Caldwell, New Jersey, where he has hybridized a number of rhododendrons and azaleas. And he told the story once of a group of people from the Rhododendron Society visited Laurelwood, and he said you could have 5 people stand in front of a pinkish reddish flower and they'll argue what color it is. So it's difficult.
I understand that. I used to actually work in book publishing and production, And color that you use for printing is very different than the color that you use on a computer
Mhm.
screen.
Yeah,
And everybody actually sees color differently, so I understand that conundrum.
yeah,
I notice at the end of your list here, I think it's the next slide, that you have your legend where you have what the initials H or G or R means. And I find that interesting that so many of these have H, of course, which is hybridized by, and
right.
some other ones on the previous list had R, which was raised by, or N for name by.
Yeah, I switched to slide number 2 because I wanted to point that out, and as well as if you look on the second column, Paul Vosper, one of the problems I have sometimes is I talk about the rhododendron by their name and people think I'm talking about a person. Uh, but Paul Vosper, which is one of my favorite um, rhododendrons at Laurelwood, we have 2 of them. Um, Paul Vosper, the person, was a hybridizer. He started as a rose company, and he perfected a way of making it easy to propagate rhododendrons from cuttings over the years. And he was named along with the head of the Arboretum at Harvard and the head of the Arboretum at Swarthmore to study the Dexter rhododendrons. So he was pretty high up there in rhododendron circles back in the day. He became a very good friend of the Nippenbergs. He visited Laurelwood many times, and he may be the reason a lot of the Dexter cuttings showed up at Laurelwood Gardens. So in 1965, he gave a small unnamed plant, it was about 15 inches tall, according to Dorothy's correspondence, to Dorothy Nippenberg. She then grew it and named it after him, and then registered it in 1994. It's a late blooming, very red rhododendron. We have one at the south end of Dorothy's Way, and there's also one on Ridge Road, which is in not good shape because it was hit by one of the trucks that go through there, and it broke some of the branches. Some of the others that you see, many times hybridizers will hybridize something just for their own benefit. There was never any intention to commercialize it, or they were trying to find a specific color, and after time they realized, well, this is not the pink I wanted, so they never proceeded with it. In Dorothy's case, we have letters of hers between Dorothy and the registrar of the uh, Royal Horticultural Society, where she was trying to register about a dozen of her hybrids. And over the years, things really tightened up, especially with nomenclature. And they didn't like the name of some of them. And if they don't like the name, they turn it down. And that's what they did in several cases. And it was interesting to me, not having known Dorothy, but reading in between the lines of her last letter to them was, I have too much work to do in the gardens. I don't have time for this administrative stuff. So she never went ahead with it. So a lot of her hybrids don't exist in the Arboretum. They may never have existed. A number of her, like Laurel Pink that you see down in the lower left-hand corner, that was actually growing. We have photographs of many of these at her home across the street. And what may have happened is when the property was sold and redeveloped, they went by the wayside. But for many years, Laurel Pink was available at a nursery in New York State, I've actually reached out over the past year to the New York chapter of the Rhododendron Society to see if anybody had any of these. At the Dexter Gardens in Sandwich, Massachusetts, they have Great Eastern, and we're hoping they will get us some cuttings from it that we can propagate.
Joe, do you have any information about the rhododendron propagation?
Yeah, that's coming up. You asked earlier about John Nippenberg's
Yes.
involvement. He actually gets credit for hybridizing Wayne Pink. If you look under registration, John F. Nippenberg gets credit for that. That we have photographs of. I could tell by the photograph that it was along the driveway of their home across the street. If it exists in the Arboretum, we haven't found it. So it's unfortunate that happened. To give you an example of the lower greenhouses where the Nippenberg Center is located now, the inside will show you some of the rooted cuttings. And this is an example of some of the cuttings. We have records showing at one time they had 9,000 seedlings on the hill, which is now up where Cedar Hill is, if you go into the Arboretum. So they had a lot. They did a lot of propagation and hybridization. I think a lot of people don't realize these are cold frames and what are like hoop gardens that would be covered in the winter time. They had over 6,000 Charles Dexter seedings at one time. So they're, I try to explain to people when I take a tour, give a tour, if you've been through sections of, especially along one section of Ridge Road, but a better example would be on Cedar Hill. You'll see big green grass areas with stanchions for irrigation. And I try to explain to people that irrigation isn't there to water the lawn. That's where they had a lot of their cold frames. And they also had several test gardens where hybridizers or nurseries from other parts of the country would send them plants so they could see if they would survive in the northeastern New Jersey winter. The Nippenbergs had developed not only a business relationship, but a very strong friendship with Ted Van Veen from Van Veen Nursery in Portland, Oregon, where they would send hundreds of cuttings, mail them to Van Veen Nursery. Van Veen would propagate them, grow them, and sell them at their nursery in Portland. We still have a connection with them. Ted Van Veen has passed away. Unfortunately, his daughter Kathy, who I had contact with, has since passed away. I believe she bequeathed the nursery to the Portland chapter of the Rhododendron Society, and their volunteers still run it. We have had them propagate. They do custom propagation there. The public can go onto their website and send them cuttings as well. And we purchased young plants from them. So we've kind of kept that relationship going. This is the old propagation greenhouse, which is was on Home Hill, which was demolished, and in its place, the one on the right is the new propagation greenhouse, which opened last year. Laurelwood is very successful in getting a substantial grant from the Passaic County Open Space Program, a significant contribution from the mayor and council of the Township of Wayne, and also a significant amount that was fundraised by Laurelwood Arboretum to build this greenhouse. And we use it to propagate for plants that we will put back into the Arboretum. And we also use it to overwinter plants from, for instance, the sensory garden, where we have a lot of exotic plants. And in the end of October, we will remove all of those, including the banana trees, and we will store them in the greenhouse over the winter because they would not survive. Because of this greenhouse, we were able to restart a propagation program, and over the last 2 years, we've propagated about 50 plants, probably 30 azaleas, some of which we sold at our last plant sale, and a number of rhododendrons, which I would like to speak about shortly, that we took cuttings from rhododendrons, and we will be planting some of them back into the Arboretum in the spring. One of the things I tell the public when I take a tour is that of the 400 or so rhododendrons that we have in the Arboretum, many of them, the majority of them, are not available any longer in the commercial market. We have some rather unique rhododendrons. I like to talk about Babylon, which the records indicate the Knippenbergs purchased from England in the 1950s. We have 4 of them. One of them on Long Valley Road is close to 20 feet tall. A lot of people are surprised by that, and I always tell them that if you look up the word rhododendron, which comes from the Greek, it means rose tree. And many of the rhododendrons we have look like trees. They're not the dense bushes that someone would have in front of their home. So we have been taking cuttings from many of the more unique ones, because we know if they should be damaged by a bad weather condition, we can't just reach out and buy a new one. That's just not possible.
Excuse me, Joe, I have a question. You'd mentioned that with the azaleas, you're able to sell or offer them for sale at your plant sale. Do you also offer for sale some of the cuttings from the rhododendrons?
We do not for the cuttings, but 2 years ago, we purchased 10 one-year-old rhododendrons from Van Veen Nursery in Portland. I think they were $10 each. We grew them for 2 more years in the greenhouse, and we did sell those at a plant sale. It was a rhododendron called America, which is a bright red. We have several of them in the Arboretum. It was hybridized by a nursery in the Netherlands. And I guess I've already told you my history background. The Netherlands was probably the first country to recognize the United States in 1776. And I just thought it was kind of interesting that they were able, Van Ness and Sons in the Netherlands not only created this hybrid, but named it America. So we sold 10 of those at the Arboretum. We also have the educational greenhouse, which is the one you see if you park in front of the Knippenberg Center. That was also the result of grants and contributions. That greenhouse is used mainly by a volunteer group to propagate and plant with seedlings for plants that we sell at the plant sale. They take cuttings from plants within the Arboretum. We also have a great supply of what we call mother plants, where they take cuttings from the original plant, especially geraniums and some others, and they grow them over the winter. And then in May, we sell them as a fundraiser. We did, as I indicated, started our propagation program. One of the things we were able to do is Dr. Fitzberg, who I talked about earlier, had an unnamed azalea growing in his garden that he hybridized, had been there over 20 years, and he offered it to us to name. And I worked with the former executive director of the Arboretum to put together an application to the Royal Horticultural Society to name it Laurelwood Sunset. And we picked Laurelwood Sunset because it was kind of a pinkish orange color, which looked like the sun setting. And I went to Dr. Nippenberg's home. You have to measure the leaves, measure the bloom, measure the plant, take photographs. And we were able to successfully have it named. We since have removed it from Dr. Fitzberg's home, and it's now growing in the Arboretum. We then took cuttings from them and we sent them to Van Veen Nursery to propagate for us for the first time. And these are the very young cuttings that were rooted. And they mailed them back to us. And we then were able to pot them. And I think it took us 3 years to get them large enough to then sell at the plant sale. And they did bloom. Since that time, we've taken cuttings from either the mother plant or some of the young ones that we propagated. And I have in the propagation greenhouse right now, probably a dozen or 15 that we rooted in February of this past year. I brought one home with me. I don't know if I can get it on the camera or not, but I'll show you what it looks like, maybe.
You'd have to stop sharing. So
yeah, I'll wait till at the end.
To the end, yeah.
But you'll see what it looks like after 9 months. We also did the same with cuttings from rhododendrons. We have a team, as a matter of fact, we'll be going out in September, which is generally a good time to take cuttings. We'll bring them back to the propagation greenhouse, try to root them. It takes about 4 to 5 months. It's not an easy process. This year, the first year we did it, we were only 22% successful. Last year, we were 45% successful. And we should be over 80% successful. One of our problems is you really need heat from below. The old greenhouse that I showed you earlier, the heat came up from below. We don't have that in the new propagation greenhouse. And for the roots to develop, they need to be about 75 degrees, not the air temperature, but the median temperature. So we do have, which we'll be using this year, electric mats that we'll be putting the cuttings on. And I'll be getting together a small group of volunteers in the next couple of weeks. We'll come up with a list of the mature rhododendrons in the Arboretum that we'd like to take cuttings from. We've actually taken cuttings from a few gardens in the Pines Lake area where people had a specific named hybrid that they knew of, and it was one we were looking for, and we went to their house and took cuttings. As I think I said to Patty earlier, one thing you learn with this program is patience, because it takes quite a while, not only for the root to develop, but quite a while for the new plant to actually bloom. In that case, it could take 3 to 5 years. The other thing I'm involved in, and this is what I indicated earlier, we made a concentrated effort this year with volunteers to restart the plant identification and cataloging program that had been started over the years. And the board of directors of Laurelwood, the Friends of Laurelwood Arboretum, established a plant collection management committee in 2016. We then started a program and developed a computerized database where we could keep track of all of our rhododendrons in the database. And I'm going to show you a form. We have, you know, the obvious things, the botanical name and the common name, the description of not only the foliage, but the flower. We have photos. We created an accession number, which I'll show you, which will help you find the plant in the Arboretum. We have about 1,600, a little over 1,600 plants. We have, while I concentrate right now only on the rhododendrons, we have a team that concentrates on shrubs and trees. In 2017, the Rutgers Master Gardener Program awarded our Plant Collection Management Committee the State Award for Excellence for what we're doing with respect to plant collection. I mentioned just now the Friends of Laurelwood Arboretum. I should have mentioned in more detail that John Nippenberg passed away in 1995, and Dorothy continued her work in the Arboretum with a number of friends and volunteers that helped her along. And in 2003, the group started the Friends of Laurelwood Arboretum, which is a 501c3 nonprofit corporation. And after Dorothy passed away in 2006, and she lived into her 90s, the group approached the town of Wayne, because if you recall, the agreement was that upon their death, it would become a public park. And over the years, John Nippenberg transferred, I think there were 15 individual parcels of land that made up the 30 acres. He transferred it lot by lot, parcel by parcel over the years. I think he finished in the 1970s to the town of Wayne. So they became owners, but part of the deal was Dorothy and John would continue to be able to use the site until they passed away. So after her passing, this nonprofit group, Friends of Laurelwood Arboretum, approached the town of Wayne and said, we'd like to administer and manage the site on your behalf. And they entered into a written agreement, which still exists, it's renewed periodically, where the Friends of Laurelwood Arboretum is the managing agent for the site. The Township of Wayne provides some of the funding. Laurelwood relies heavily on memberships, grants, which, as I indicated, I have helped write, and contributions, and are probably almost 200 volunteers. Many of the volunteers are involved in non-horticultural things. They might do administrative work, work on the computer, give tours. They used to only volunteer on Tuesdays. Now there's a volunteer day every day of the week. We have a team on Fridays that do pruning. We have a team on Thursdays that work in the native plant garden. Today was a group of high school kids that come in and work. So although it's a public park owned by the town of Wayne, it's really run by Friends of Laurelwood Arboretum. And they were responsible for starting our plant collection program.
I have a question for you. You
Yeah.
had mentioned about the administrative aspect, and for someone like me who likes uh, putting things in databases so it can be found, um, you brought up the slide I was looking for about your accessioning and your labeling.
Mhm.
It sounds it's like something I could really enjoy doing myself.
Well, we did a lot of research, and think of an accession number that it really comes about from the numbering system a museum uses to catalog all the artifacts in a museum. And it's not unlike a Dewey Decimal System in a library. And if you look at the plant label at the bottom of the screen, we purchased the plant labels from a company actually in Ohio, and they're made out of aluminum. And some of them we've now had 5 years and they look as good as they did from the beginning. And in it, and this is um, a native plant in our native plant garden, it includes the botanical name across the top. It'll include the variety or common name, which in this case is spice bush. And the last line on all the plant tags is the accession number. And the first 2 digits, it's where it's located in the Arboretum. So whenever we see uh, a plant label 3D, we know it's the native plant garden. And I'm going to show you on the next slide how we come about that. The third digit S, it means it's a shrub, or it would say R for rhododendron, A for azalea, or T for tree. The next 4 digits are the year it was planted in the Arboretum and assessed in the database. And the last 5 digits are a unique number just to that plant. So that if we go into the database and look for plant 65, it's going to bring up spice bush. Not only is it going to include everything about it, but we can trace information about it. If it had a disease, if it had been pruned, photographs of it. If it died, we have a separate database for plants that died, and then we retire the number. But we keep a record of why it died. It might be the location was the wrong location. So it's a pretty detailed. We've actually had other gardens in New Jersey come and look at our database because we are pretty far ahead of some of the others.
Would you be able to show me how to find on a map where that spice bush
Okay,
is?
here you go. As part of our session, we took the Arboretum and we divided it up into 9 distinct areas and then sub areas within them. So that if you look at the native plant garden, you'll see 3D, it's right in front of the Nippenberg Center. That's where the 3D comes from. So if you were looking for the Paul Vosberg plant I indicated, it's going to be, I can't really see without my glasses, unfortunately, but I believe it's 8B, which is at the southern end of Dorothy's Way. Now, it's kind of general. You have to get to that area and find it. This is probably the first step in what a lot of gardens, which have a lot of resources that we don't have, which use global positioning, where they could find the precise location of the plant. We're not at that point yet, and I'm not sure we ever will be. If the board decides to go in that direction in the future, there are grants that we can get to create a program like that. But right now, we use this system. And the other reason it's important is we can then produce a report. If I want to know all of the rhododendrons that are in section 8D, which is up on Hickory Hill, it will print them out for me. And why is that important? Well, it's important for our pruning team. where rather than just scatter around the Arboretum, they do most of the pruning section by section. So if they decided, okay, this Friday we're going to prune all the rhododendrons in 8D, or it could be the bushes because we'd get a separate report. They know how many there are. It's also important because we use holly tone to fertilize a lot of our rhododendrons and azaleas, that we could do it section by section, and we know how much to buy in a particular week. If we took 2C, which is up on Home Hill, there's a summer garden there. There's a lot of rhododendrons there. So it's become very helpful. And the kinds of reports we can get are almost unlimited. This is an example of, on the left, of what the database looks like. At the time this was done, we had 403 records, which means we had 403 distinct hybrid rhododendrons, as well as I think we have 10 species in the database. And it will give, it shows you the tag for the plant, the accession number, its name. This happens to be one of my favorites, America. Its color, a detailed description of its foliage and its flower. When it blooms, there are 7 distinct blooming times for rhododendrons. The majority of the ones in Laurelwood bloom what's called the mid-season, which is around Mother's Day to the end of May. People often ask me about the bloom time when I'm giving a tour, and I always indicate to them, while there's a written report on the bloom time, I don't think the plants have read it, because depending on the climate, they might bloom at a different time, but they generally do bloom within that time frame. There's also indication of whether it's fragrant or not. Most rhododendrons are not fragrant, but we do have a number that are. What type of rhododendron it is, whether it's a large leaf or a small leaf, who the hybridizer was, and then the last is where it's located in the Arboretum. So this would say section 2A, and then we add, it's on the right side of Easy Way. So it'll help us find it. The record on the right is what the record looks like for each individual rhododendron. In this case, it's Paul Vosberg, where we have photographs of the bloom, photographs of the plant. This is the one down on Dorothy's Way, and a lot of the other detailed information. And then in the remarks column, because at some point we would like to have this available for the public to at least view on their computers, that it was hybridized by Paul Vosberg, and it was named by Dorothy, and she in 1975. So we like to keep a record of that also. This is the current rhododendron collection. As I indicated, we have over 400 plants. A number of people on the tour asked me, well, how do you know? Did you go around and count them all? And the question is kind of. As I indicated, Dorothy left pretty detailed records, and I went through her multi-page report, and I counted up 422 rhododendrons by name that were in her report. It did not include a lot of the species that are around the perimeter of the site. And in some cases, she would just say a cluster of Dexter rhododendrons. So I knew she had 422 at one time. I think there's over 500, and we've identified about 400 by name. Of those 400, we have 90 distinct hybrids or varieties. In some cases, there are more than one, like Van Ness Sensation. We may have 6 of those. And then we've found so far 10, which is all the way on the right, species, many of which either bloom very early or very late. The Cronulatum is a species that blooms very early. I've seen it blooming in the Arboretum when there's still snow on the ground. You'll see some of them around the pond and other locations, and others bloom late. Some of the latest blooming ones we have along the perimeter are species. So this gives you an indication of what the collection looks like. This next year, we're going to concentrate on azaleas. We haven't spent a lot of time on azaleas. The horticultural manager is in the process, actually starting next month, of restoring some of the azalea collection. We have probably over 60 azaleas sitting in a pen, which we call the temporary nursery, which will be planted along Azalea Way by volunteers in September. And we will then enter the data for each of those into the database. So
Does this mean that in a couple of years, you and I can do another program on the azaleas?
Hopefully. I'm just going to show you, if I could hold it in front of my face. This is the Laurelwood Sunset. Cuttings were taken last September. They were rooted in February and potted in March. And these pots have been sitting outside in the pen, outside the propagation greenhouse. So this is less than a year old, and this is what it looks like.
And how big will that become eventually?
Well, we have some that are like 3 feet tall that we've, this will probably bloom this spring. And I mentioned Van Ness Sensation. We took some cuttings from several of the plants. If you're in the Arboretum, there's a large one next to what we call the volunteer garage in the parking lot off of Vale Road. And when you see them bloom about the 3rd week in March, it's stunning. And there's one, if you're walking up Home Hill, it's right on the corner of the fairway. And we took cuttings from both of those. Again, they rooted in February. This is what one looks like after 8 months. Now, in this case, probably by next year, it'll be this high. It's going to take at least 3 years or longer for it to bud and bloom. So I talked about the patience of, as I indicated to Patty, part of my research, I discovered that many of these early hybridizers who were born in the late 1800s lived until they were in their late 90s. And think about it for a minute. They survived the last pandemic. And I thought, gee, it must be great to be outside. And I came to the conclusion it was all about stress. There was really no stress because you just had to wait. You just had to watch that plant grow, and you couldn't force it along. You couldn't get it to, well, you could get it to bloom earlier than it might otherwise bloom. But I guess my point is, for people that like to volunteer at Laurelwood, especially in the greenhouse over the winter, there's nothing greater than being in that greenhouse when it's snowing out in the middle of the winter and seeing some of the plants blooming when it's 30 degrees outside in February.
So if you want to live long, you become
I hope so.
Volunteer.
Well, the other interesting thing is a number of the people, you mentioned Guy Nearing when we were talking, they had medical problems over their lifetime, especially when they were younger. And their doctor suggested they get outside in nature. and that's how they got involved in hybridizing. So
We're running out of time here, but I did want to ask one or two more questions
sure.
before we make announcements. When you and I were talking earlier about Guy Nearing, before we started, I had come across some information about the Nearing propagating frame, and you had given me some very interesting information about that I thought would be worth sharing.
Yeah, well, Guy Nearing, who had visited Laurelwood many times, he knew the Nippenberg. He had several nurseries in New Jersey. I think the last one was in Ramsey. He had pretty bad luck. He lost several of his nurseries to flooding. But we have a number of his rhododendrons in the Arboretum. He specialized in small leaf rhododendrons. Like, if you didn't know the difference, some of them look like azaleas. We have quite a few of them. But during his lifetime, he developed what became the Nearing frame. He actually patented it and sold it throughout the country. We used to have one at Laurelwood, but when the lower greenhouses were demolished, it went by the wayside. One of the things our horticultural manager is trying to set up is to find an Eagle Scout that might want to take it on as a project to build one. There are other types of cold frames, doesn't have to be a Nearing frame, but if you Google it, you could probably find on the internet the original plans of how to build one. So we hope to recreate one in the next year.
That's interesting to me, and I hope you are able to do it. I'd love to see it. One of the other things I wanted to mention here is that I believe prior to the pandemic, there was a rhododendron spring festival that was happening, and do you think it might be able to occur soon in the
Well,
spring?
I've put together a report for the new program committee. I think they have a meeting coming up in September, which I'm going to attend, and propose that we reinstate it, hopefully for the weekend after Mother's Day, with tours. I have a few programs in mind on propagation to show people how they could propagate plants in their home garden, and maybe a couple other programs. So we do hope to start that up again.
That would be wonderful. I just want to share the Laurelwood Arboretum website where the road and show where the rhododendron information is there for anyone who would like to follow up. So if you go to the website of laurelwoodarboretum.org and go under gardens to the hybrid rhododendron collections link, it'll bring you to this page. And there's just so much information here with great photographs. I love seeing the different colors and learning more about the rhododendrons. And there's a whole video here about them in bloom. So for those of us who are stuck in our houses and need some outdoor time, that's a great way to explore it. So there we go. I also want to make an announcement too that next Wednesday night, if you haven't had a chance to register, we are having another Wayne Public Library and Laurelwood Arboretum program about a sculpture trail that is going to be having its grand opening on September 18th. And it's absolutely amazing what they have been able to do with the sculptures. So on our online calendar, you would be able to register for next Wednesday night. Joe, is there anything else you would like to add? I have about 25 more questions I would love to ask you. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. So you and
Patty,
I
I would just like to thank you and your staff and the library for allowing us to set up our display in the library. For anyone who hasn't seen it, it'll be there for another few days till the end of August, which gives some information on some of the material you've heard tonight. We also have copies of some of our brochures on the sculpture trail, how to become a member of Laurelwood Arboretum, as well as a booklet that we published on the legacy of the Nippenbergs, which is available for the public to pick up and take home. Well,
And
thank
I
you very
want to
much.
thank you also for putting that together because it's absolutely amazing. We are actually going to hopefully keep it up into the first week of September, if that's okay with you, Joe. And hopefully everyone can come to the library and see the wonderful panels he put together with the information, and also pick up a copy of the booklet. It really is so informative, and for someone who knew very little, I've learned a lot from it. So I want to thank you, and thank you for taking the time tonight to meet with me and share your information, Joe.